Hello everyone, 400 Rabbits here, introducing you to episode 12 of the Ask Historians podcast. Today we will be talking about the Spanish Civil War. We have a little bit of a twist on our regular interview format, this time being more of a panel. TasfromTAS will be interviewing or kind of hosting and moderating the panel, and of course being his usual inquisitive self. And our speakers today will be Dominicanes and tobbinator. So take up your rifle, pick a side, and enjoy.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast, Jason and Thomas.
Hello.
Hello.
Alrighty. Okay, now, Jason, you are AKA as Dominicanes, is that correct?
That's correct.
And your flair covers what on Ask Historians?
It covers Pius XII during World War II. I also post on the Spanish Civil War and military aviation and a few other topics.
Okay, awesome. Now, what got you into studying the Spanish Civil War in particular?
Well, I grew up Catholic and was interested in World War II. That brought me to the subject of Pius XII during World War II. There's a big controversy with that. And while studying that, I came across an oddity within church history of 3 papal encyclicals that were put out in 1 month. And one of them had to do with the situation in Spain, at least in part, and the other 2 touched on it tangentially as well. And I just kept on following the rabbit hole, basically, into the Spanish Civil War, and got into studying the war overall, especially the Basques and the anti-clerical violence in Spain during that period.
Right. Yes. Okay. Actually, I can see why the Basques would be interesting as well because of the choices they had to make. But we'll get into that later on. Now, Thomas, you are AKA as tobbinator on the forums. What does your flair cover?
Well, my flair covers the Spanish Civil War and the Revolution that happened simultaneously in Spain.
Okay. And what got you into studying that?
A couple of years ago, started getting identified with the anarchist movement, and I read Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell, and that got me interested in the Spanish Civil War.
Okay.
And here we are.
Right. Okay, so just for people who are not super familiar, I'm just going to read the Wikipedia overview of the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War was fought from July 1936 to April 1939 between the Republicans, who are loyal to the established Spanish Republic, and the Nationalists, a rebel group led by General Francisco Franco. The Nationalists prevailed and Franco ruled Spain for the next 36 years, until his death in 1975. So, when we're looking at this story, I guess it's useful to go for a bit of background and context. So, what was Spain like during the early 1930s, before the breakout of hostilities?
I can jump in here.
Sure.
The Spanish Republic was established in 1930 after a 7-year military dictatorship. The left won the first elections in 1931. They instituted a number of land reforms and secularization policies. Because the church was heavily identified with the Spanish government prior to that. Then in 1933, the right-wing parties won the general elections, and they fought against some of those reforms that they saw were revolutionary. And then you have a small revolt by the leftists in 1934, which was violently put down by the right. And then in 1936, you have another rightist. In 1936, you have the leftists win the election again, the Popular Front, and the rightists through a coup, basically a military coup. And you also have to make sure to look at there was a nasty drought, especially in southern Spain in 1936, and then heavy rains. The drought was in 35 and going into 36. There was also heavy rains in early 36, which ruined some other crops. So there was some serious hunger issues going on as well.
Okay, so it's not like everything was peaceful and fine, and then all of a sudden violence broke out. This was sort of, an escalation of a pattern that had been going on for a while.
Absolutely. Paul Preston, I'm reading currently The Spanish Holocaust, and he talks about, his words are polarization and radicalization, with both sides antagonizing each other and just becoming more polarized, less room in the middle, no moderates that are able to have any real way to speak at all.
Okay, and what was the Spanish throne, the King of Spain, doing during this?
Well, he abdicated in 1930. King Alfonso XIII.
Oh, okay.
There was actually there's another claimant or line of claimants that are the Carlists, and there's the Alfonsists. The Alfonsists, King Alfonso XIII was the latest Alfonsist. There was another group of monarchists, just to make the Spanish Civil War even more confusing, that backed a different claimant to the throne. They were called the Carlists.
Okay. All right, and so when we talk, and perhaps Thomas might want to jump in on this, so when we talk about the right and the left in this point, how accurate is that sort of label? When we talk about the left, how unified was the left?
It wasn't very unified, really. The Popular Front had very few common goals that they wanted. Their party line didn't particularly outline much detail.
So the Popular Front, is this the faction that won the election in 36 or 35?
Yes, the 36.
Right. Okay, so they were fractured. What were some of the factions within the Popular Front then?
We start with, you had the general just Republicans who wanted to retain the democratic republic that had been established, and they feared that the right was trying to establish a dictatorship or re-establish the monarchy. Then you've got the Republican left, who was a large faction within them, led by the former Prime Minister Manuel Azaña, and also dominating the Popular Front there was the Socialist Party of Spain, which had a rather large swaying power and also had strong connections to their trade union, the General Union of Workers, the UGT, which had lots of conflicts with another similar trade union, the Anarchist trade union, the CNT, the National Confederation of Labour.
Right, so we're starting to get into this alphabet soup problem that you get with the Spanish Civil War. Okay. Sorry, go on.
The Socialists also had their rival within the Popular Front, the Communist Party, which was trying to sway its own power within the Popular Front.
Now, the Communist Party here, how influenced was that from Russia?
It pretty closely followed the Comintern policy at the time, and initially denounced the Socialists as social fascists.
Right, okay. But then ended up working with them. All right. Okay, so we might get into some of... Actually, one thing I did want to talk about. Now, what were the regions of Spain like? So there are a couple of areas in Spain, particularly Catalonia and the Basque region, which are, I guess, separate nations within the country of Spain. So was there anything in particular we need to be aware of with those regions? How sort of independent were they within the Spanish sort of machinery of government?
Well, there were some provisions for home rule, but prior to 1936, they were circumspect. It was a feeling out process. But each of these factions that we're going to talk about has an overlay of either regionalist or nationalist, because you'll find some Catalan they would consider themselves Catalan regionalists. They would call themselves Catalan nationalists that had very little to do with the left. They were wanting Catalonia free, but you would also have Catalan leftists, rightists. You'd have Basques, right and left. There are overlapping Venn diagrams, I guess is one way you could look at it.
Right. And was that an issue that affected both sides? So actually, go on.
Well, I would say it affected the nationalist side less, just because they were nationalists. They wanted one united Spain, and anything that got in the way of that was just unacceptable. I would think on the left, in the Republicans, there was much more conflict over the Basques and the Catalans and the Asturians.
Okay. Now, when we talk about Catalonia, what part of Spain is that?
You're looking mostly at the northeast side of Spain, Barcelona, etc.
Okay, and the Basque region, where's that?
Basically north central Spain. Yeah, they had a long time enclave there.
Yep. And now, were there any... because I've noticed with Catalonia, they always talk about Barcelona, but with the Basque region, is there any sort of really major cities in there, or is it a bit more devolved?
Bilbao, I believe, is the big industrial center. Guernica, which we will probably get to later, is more of a spiritual center, a touchstone rather than a megalopolis.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, then let's talk about why did the coup form? So why, what was it about the election that the military found unacceptable?
Well, okay, you have to get into a little bit of what happened before, in that there were some very odd choices by the Catholic Church in Spain during this time. You have some writers, Father Tusquets, Father de Castro Albarán, as well as some in the Spanish hierarchy. I'm sure most of our listeners have probably heard of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is this nasty conspiracy theory book that was going around at the time that was blaming the Jews for everything under the sun. There was a weird Spanish offshoot of that, in that, especially in the writings of Father Tusquets, he describes what he calls a Jewish Masonic Bolshevik conspiracy to overthrow Spain and to destroy the Catholic Church, etc. It sounds insane, especially since there were very few Jews in Spain at the time. It's hard to have a Jewish conspiracy with just a handful of Jews.
Had they left the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, or there just wasn't that many ever?
Well, yeah, they were expelled in 1492, etc., going back to medieval times, and there were some refugees from Germany at the time, but it was a very small number. But you have this. I mean, this sounds insane now to talk about it, but this was a widely held belief. You do have leftists, communists that are anti-clerical, that are giving out anti-clerical propaganda, and there were serious problems, obviously, in the Catholic Church at this time that should have been pointed out by the left, and were. But you have these people that think that on the nationalist side, that think the world is coming to an end. That democracy in the 1930s wasn't looking all that good. America, Great Britain, France, they're all struggling. The fascists are doing well and the communists are doing well. You kind of have to go one way or the other, and they thought this election in 1936, the left wins, we're going to lose everything if we don't act right now.
Right,
and
okay.
It was based on things that basically were blatantly not true, but they wanted to hang on to the power that they had at that moment, and they thought if they didn't, the revolution was coming, and they were all going up against the wall.
Okay, and well, then we might jump to Thomas. So what were the nationalist government, the Republican government that was elected, do we know much about their plans? How legitimate were the fears of the nationalists that they were all, going to lose everything?
Well, the Socialist Party was pushing for a strong land reform line, with modernizing the country and industrializing the country, and abandoning their large landowners by allowing more work for ordinary people on the farms instead of the smallholder system that they had previously.
Right. And so this would have represented a major upheaval to the way things were doing. So, I mean, how were they planning on doing it? Just stripping large landowners of their titles? Go on.
There was a government organisation established for the redistribution of land. Well, they didn't get much funding, and I think it was 200,000 farms were redistributed to peasants.
Right, so this was actually happening. So this wasn't just planned. This was in place.
Very slowly.
Right. Okay. And what other policies, I guess, were the Republicans in favour of?
They generally strengthened the unions against the industrial bourgeoisie.
Okay.
If I could just add one other thing, they were also again trying to secularize the government at that time as well. Most of it was probably a good idea, and having a state-established religion isn't all that popular of an idea anymore around most of the planet. But some of it was petty, like taxing the number of times a church bell could ring, or not allowing religious funerals or processions. But there was also needed reform in the secularization process in Spain that was violently resisted by the Nationalists.
So what sort of, when we talk about needed reform, let's go into a bit more detail there. So yeah.
Well, you literally have people dying of starvation in some parts of Spain in 1935 and 1936 because they're given starvation wages. The union workers are kept away from the farms by force, and it's an absolutely awful situation for a lot of people. I mean, when you're hungry, it's one thing. When your family is hungry, you're gonna take things to the extreme because you have to.
Right. Okay, and what role did the Catholic Church play in maintaining the existing power structure? What were they? Because obviously, when you look at places like South America, the church or certain priests within the church are agitators for social reform. What was the case in Spain at the time?
You had some of that. I don't want to say that the entire Catholic Church in Spain was just a den of iniquity, but you had a lot of vocal priests that were doing this bizarre Jewish Masonic Bolshevik conspiracy stuff. You have various other thinkers and people in the hierarchy that are justifying rebellion. And in the Catholic Church, I mean, you're looking at just war theory going back a few hundred years, and there was no theology of rebellion. That had to be literally invented, is the word that Jose Sanchez uses to describe it. You had to come up with a way of describing your revolt as being legitimate so that the normal Catholic followers would go with the idea. And without that justification in place from the Catholic hierarchy, especially from Archbishop Goma, and there were a number of other bishops as well, that put out homilies, and the Catholic newspapers, etc., were justifying the idea of a rebellion against a duly elected government, which without that, I don't think that the revolution by the military would have been supported by the rank and file.
Okay. Now, Thomas, this is probably a question for you. In the areas that I'm familiar with, probably the labour movement in Australia, there's a really strong identification of the left with the Catholic Church. So unionists tend to be almost certainly Catholics in Australian history. But it looks like secularism was really, really strong within the Spanish left. Were there many religious leftists, I guess, in Spain at this point?
The religious left wasn't really that large. There was a strong focus of the left in Spain was focused at separating the church and the state, because the Spanish church had a strong connection with the state, still controlling education and all that.
Righto. And so by controlling education, was that so your regular sort of, I guess, state-run schools would have, priests and nuns coming in and delivering lessons and things like that? Yeah,
religious education.
Right.
It's just ingrained in the education system.
Now, you could say partly that the Basques were part of the religious left. They were much more into social justice issues, making sure that unions were respected, etc. So, and they heavily identified as Catholic. So there is that as well.
Okay, and what about Catalonia?
Catalonia had a very strong anarchist movement. With the CNT had its heartlands in Catalonia, especially Barcelona.
So the CNT, what's that again?
The National Confederation of Labour.
And so that was a large trade union?
It was a large anarchist trade union with approximately 1 million members in 1936.
Wow. So how does an anarchist trade union work?
It's
Sorry, yeah, because when you say, anarchist organisation, to me, seems oxymoronic. But obviously it's not with 1 million members. They had to have some sort of structure.
It was largely based around direct consensus democracy. So votes are done with committees, mass conferences, votes on that.
And
that's how they establish their trade union lines.
Okay, and to get 1 million members, that had to be reasonably effective, right?
They were pretty effective in countering the landowners, and they had many conflicts with the police, who were often employed by landowners to counter the trade unions.
Right, okay, so strike breakers and all that sort of things.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Now, I understand that the Nationalist side was led by the army. Who were some of the key players within the army, and what were their motivations, do we know?
Well, they were called the Africanistas because they were part of the wars in Morocco after World War I in the 1920s. There were a number of just brutal wars called the Reef Wars. And these guys learned the lesson, which is a terrible lesson to learn, that brutal repression is the way to go. You ride into town, you kill a bunch of people, you decapitate them, put their heads on the ends of your bayonets, and march them to the next town, so that those people don't get out of line. And you had three main leaders: Francisco Franco, who is the most famous of them, but at the time he wasn't really the ringleader. The ringleader was this guy called General Sanjurjo. I have to apologize for my Spanish pronunciation. I can read, but I am absolutely terrible with speaking. Sanjurjo. He was killed in a plane crash on the 20th of July in 1936, right at the very beginning of the rebellion, when he was trying to fly in. And then there was also another General Mola, and he also died in a plane crash, but in 1937, in the middle of the year. There's never really been any direct ties, but it was certainly fortuitous for Franco to end up being the one of the three to live through the whole thing and end up at the helm of Spain.
Right, yeah. Now, these wars that they were fighting in Africa, who was that? Was that sort of colonial wars, so they were fighting to suppress old colonial holdings?
Yes, this is only tangentially with my reading, but right. Yeah, it was to suppress local tribes and just institute Spanish control over the region.
Okay. Now, then, well, let's jump back to the Republicans. Then, were there any key personalities on the Republican side, Thomas?
Yeah, there were quite a few key people pushing their own little goals. There was Manuel Azaña. He was the president of the Republic in 1936. He was firm in maintaining the democracy of the Republic and tried whenever possible to maintain that. There was Francisco Largo Caballero. He was the Socialist Party leader and also a leader of the UGT, which also went into conflict against the CNT and exacerbated problems between the unions. And then we've got also Juan Negrin, also a Socialist Party member. He was an up-and-comer initially in the war and ended as the Prime Minister after Caballero resigned. And for the anarchists, we've got Buenaventura Durruti. He was a very famous anarchist in Spain through the Republic. He was later killed in combat and gave name to the famous Durruti column and also the Friends of Durruti movement, which was prominent in the May Days.
Now,
and also the...
Sorry, go on.
There was also Luis Companys, the Catalonian regional leader, head of the Socialist Party there.
Okay. Were there any prominent women on the Republican side at all?
Yeah, there was Dolores Ibarruri. She was a very famous communist orator and made a very, very lively address to the workers of Spain on the uprising, calling for them to defend against the nationalist threat.
Okay. Alrighty then, and I guess it'd be too much to hope that there were any prominent female leaders on the nationalist side, Jason?
It was almost exclusively men.
Yeah.
I don't want to completely downplay the role of women, but it was...
Well, no, I would just imagine with a conservative and conservative sort of cultural outlook, there wouldn't be too much.
And that was part of the policy as well. Yeah. I mean, the Republicans were very much for women being equal partners, and the Nationalists were not. That was not part of their worldview.
All right. Now, one more thing that I'd like to look at: how legitimate were the elections? Now, I don't want to get too presentist with this, but by the standards of the day, in Western Europe, how well run were the elections?
In 1936, I don't recall any real objections other than the Nationalists who lost.
So they didn't have problems with, corruption as such. They just didn't like the result.
Well, in the 33 elections, you had serious problems where the Nationalists sometimes won 99% of an area.
Yeah, okay.
But that was when they won in 1933. When they lost in 36, there was much less allegations that I'm aware of. Possibly others have more information here, but I don't recall any real legitimate objections to the way that the election went.
And what was the franchise like? Was it, universal, people over 18 could vote, or could women vote?
I actually don't know.
Women could first vote in the 1933 election.
Right.
Okay, I thought that was right, but I all of a sudden was questioning myself. I'm like, wait, oh no.
Okay, so 1933. All right, I'm just trying to think of when other European countries granted women the vote. That seems relatively late. But anyway, I guess we'll have to look into that. Okay, so now let's look at the coup. How long was it in planning? Was it a very well planned coup?
It was effective. The planning was well thought out. I would definitely say that they had this as a contingency plan long before the elections took place. Months. The ideological underpinnings go back years. With this whole theology of rebellion thing that Jose Sanchez talks about. But you have Mola was kind of the center of the spider web for most of the planning, and he was contacting various generals that he knew, especially the ones that were the Africanistas, who had this shared experience, and they tried to figure out who was going to go with them and who wasn't, but you didn't want to play all of your cards. Most of Mola's correspondence, I don't believe, survived the war, or it certainly didn't survive afterwards, to show just how deep the conspiracy was.
Right.
But it seems to have been mostly the military, and then the Falange, which is a fascist group in Spain, who were also involved in the conspiracy as well.
Right. So when they talk about Phalangists, were the generals themselves, I guess, ideological fascists?
It depends on whose definition of fascist you like.
Right.
There are a number of competing definitions. I don't personally think that the Spanish generals were fascist. Thomas can feel free to disagree with me here, but I think that they were much more in the conservative mold rather than the fascist mold. They were comfortable with using monarchism and fascism and big business and big agriculture and the church to get what they wanted. They weren't so much the whole... they weren't entirely similar to Italian and German versions of fascism, as far as I read the definition of fascism to go.
Did you want to jump in here, Thomas?
Yes, they weren't really fascists of the traditional kind. There was no real mass movement behind the generals. The Falange espoused that view of a mass movement, but they were quickly marginalized within the nationalist movement once the war got going.
And there weren't all that many Phalangists either. They only got a single-digit percent in the 1936 elections. They had a lot of armed people running around, but they were more of a vocal, tiny minority rather than a huge movement.
Righto. And how surprised were the Republicans by the coup? Did they not see it coming?
Manuel Azaña was firm that his generals were all loyal to him, and it was only until the very last minute that he allowed his ministers to distribute arms to the local population to attempt to fight the coup.
Right. Now, was that I mean, how critical, I guess, can history be of him in that? Was he completely misguided, or were the generals just really, really sneaky?
They were very sneaky generals, but there were several organizations that were warning him at the time that a coup was being planned, and there was evidence on the table, but he was still firm that the Republic's democracy would hold firm.
Right. Okay, so when the coup formed, how quickly did the Republicans react to, the military? Well, actually, let's talk about what did the coup look like. Did it look like a bunch of guys with guns marching into Government House or whatever it was, and arresting people?
It was the local garrisons of each town declaring for or against the rebellion and seizing local government places like the local mayor and all that.
Yep.
Especially armories. Going after get the guns first.
Okay, so each of the local garrisons would make a decision. Who the leader of the garrison, I guess, would be the main one. Did many garrisons sort of split down the line and fight within each other?
The Madrid garrison was quite famous for that. There was quite a few militants outside besieging the barracks, and reportedly the surrender flag went up several times, but when the militants tried to approach them to accept their surrender, they got fired upon and the flag taken down again, which instantly there was conflict inside the barracks.
Okay, so when you say militants outside, militants aligned with which faction?
Mostly trade union militants.
Right,
A lot of them anarchists and UGT, as well as sometimes local police joined in with the militants. It depended how powerful they were locally.
So it sounds quite chaotic. How did people identify which side people were on?
You didn't really know, really.
Yeah, it was
declared for or against.
Absolute bedlam.
Right, so was there many... so what would you have the leftists... were there any particular symbols or flags or banners that sides used? Because I'm assuming, a red flag would indicate sort of communists of some kind.
The anarchists used the famous red and black flag for theirs. The nationalists flew the red and yellow Spanish flag, and the Republicans the Republican flag with red, yellow, and purple.
Right. Okay. So the nationalists flew like an older flag of Spain.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or various monarchist flags.
Right. And now the monarchy. How supportive was the monarchy of the rebellion?
I actually haven't read all that much into that.
Right.
Perhaps Thomas has some information there, but I think that the rank and file didn't much care whether the monarch was in favor of it or not.
Right,
they were going forward.
So they were carrying the king's flag, and whether the king liked it or not.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. So the coup ended up. Now I was looking at a map, and it ended up with sort of a roughly sort of 50-50 split. What were some of the major cities? So Madrid. Who ended up holding Madrid after the coup?
The Republic held Madrid. Yeah.
Okay, and how firm was their hold on Madrid?
They had a pretty well-established firm in Madrid. The siege of Madrid lasted from 1936 to the very end of the war.
So who was sieging who?
The Nationalists were besieging the Republicans in Madrid.
Okay, all right. What about other major cities? So let's say Salamanca and things like that.
Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head.
Okay, never mind.
It's been a while since I've gone through the chronology.
Let's go to the regions then. So Catalonia, which way did Catalonia break?
Catalonia went very anarchist. The local anarchists seized local government, and there was lots of revolutionary fervour in the region.
Right.
Especially in Barcelona.
Okay. And the Basque region?
They went Republican as well. It was a relatively long decision process for the leader, Jose Antonio Aguirre. Because he had deeply held Catholic roots, and he was very social justice minded as well, but he ended up going for regional autonomy over, well, I wouldn't say over his Catholic beliefs. It's not really choosing one or the other. He tried to do both.
Okay. And the local Catholic Church within the Basque region, do you know the local... I'm not sure what the ecclesiastical structure is, but was there a local bishop? Did he take a stand one way or the other?
I don't recall fully the stance that he took, but the Basque priests were famously, for their region, and then for the church. And I don't mean that in a bad way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mean that in any kind of insulting way. I have all the respect in the world for the Basques and their clergy at the time.
Okay. All right, so now one of the things that's remarkable, I guess, about the Spanish Civil War is the amount of international support that it attracted. When did international support start to kick in as far as material support goes?
Extremely early on the nationalist side. One of the keys to the revolt was getting the troops, especially the Moroccan-born troops, the regulares, from Africa, the continent, onto the Spanish peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula. And the only way to do that is to obviously cross the Mediterranean. And the Republicans held most of the navy after the revolt. So you weren't putting them on boats and taking them up against real military ships. So the only way across was aircraft. And there was a nearly immediate loan of aircraft, both from Germany and Italy, mostly German transport planes, Junkers 52s, the famous trimotors that you've probably seen in Indiana Jones. But they used those to ferry the troops over. And since the military basically went 50-50 and the population basically went 50-50, the extra troops that they were able to bring over from Morocco were absolutely critical to the nationalists having any kind of success in the war. And that started extremely early.
So does that imply that the generals had been in touch with Germany and Italy before their rebellion?
They had certainly been in touch. I mean, but it also isn't necessarily as nefarious as it sounds. It turned out to be nefarious, but they had military attachés and advisors and trainers going to Italy and Germany all the time, as well as a couple other nations. But they certainly had ideological ties via the fascist movements in the two nations, in the three nations, I mean. But it was an official thing. You knew that there were Spanish military in Italy and in Germany that were cross-training, etc. It turned out to be nefarious, but it didn't look that way at the time.
Yeah, right. Okay. Now, was there any reason why the Navy broke Republican in particular that we're aware of?
Thomas, do you have anything on this?
The sailors were largely working-class people, and they had a very strict structure with the naval officers at the top, and lots of ships declared a mutiny in favour of the Republic against their rebelling commanders.
Okay. Right. So, okay, yeah, fair enough. Okay, now what about on the Republican side? When did international support start to kick in then?
Initially, the Republic went straight to France for their aid, because France had a Popular Front government as well, and they were bordering. France responded favourably, but then they turned straight to Britain for what their stance would be, and Britain, with the rising fascist threat, they wanted to continue appeasement and establish non-intervention. So France quickly went to non-intervention and closed the borders. So the Republic was forced to ask the Soviet Union for aid, and the international brigades were formed in September that year.
Right.
And aid sent just as the Republic asked for it.
Okay, so we're talking about within a couple of months we're having international brigades being formed. Now, what were the international brigades?
The international brigades, it was an organisation of lots of international volunteers from communist parties around the world who came to Spain to help fight for the Republic. Okay. And they were mostly organised by Comintern.
Right. Now, how useful were they? Did the Republicans need bodies, or did they need artillery pieces and tanks and things like that?
The Republic, it mostly needed equipment and well-trained troops, since the bulk of the Spanish army before the coup was conscripted, under-equipped, and the Nationalists acquired most of the rifles that Spain possessed.
Okay, so they needed everything, basically.
Yeah.
Right. And what other sort of material support did the Soviet Union send?
They sent quite a large number of T-26 tanks, partly to test them, and also to help the government, of course, and as well as various aircrafts and pilots and crews for the tanks as well.
Okay, so they would send crews for the tanks. Because, I mean, sending a tank's great, but, you know, I'm assuming it's not that intuitive to just jump in a tank and, you know, off you go. Okay, now, one thing I might bring up here is the book Homage to Catalonia, or as the way it's said in Australia, Homage to Catalonia. This is George Orwell's famous book. Actually, the first book of his that I read. And this is sort of forms the large bulk of my understanding of the Civil War, actually, is from reading this book. How accurate is it? I mean, I understand that it's just one man's perspective, but, you know, is it an accurate representation of his experience in the war?
It gives a good picture of the atmosphere in Barcelona at the beginning of the war and towards the end, as the war progressed. But you need to remember that he was in a very small party within the Republic, and also was politically involved with the Barcelona May Days of 1937.
So what were the Barcelona May Days?
It was the outbreak of conflict between the Anarchists, CNT, and the POUM, the Anti-Stalinist Communist Party, against the Communist Party and the Republican government in general.
Okay. And have you read the book, Jason?
Yeah, it's been a decade, but yes, I have. Sure. It's absolutely excellent, and like Thomas points out, the only thing you have to worry about with this book is trying to expand it beyond what it is. It's an amazing account of one man's experience, but his experience was certainly not representative of the entirety of the rest of the war. It's a wonderful source. You just can't extrapolate all that much from it.
Right. So let's talk with when you've got these military units forming all over. What does an anarchist regiment look like? Did they do things differently, or did they appoint officers and use the same format that the regular Spanish army used?
They were usually very quickly established and used mostly elected officers to command them, but they were quite effective at the beginning of the war. But as conventional warfare started, their training and leadership weaknesses started to show through, and they suffered lots of morale damages.
Righto. And so that was because you had this. I mean, yeah, okay. Because I mean, it sounds with modern warfare, and with especially after if you're allowing people to elect officers, it just to me it seems like it could never work. But it did work initially.
Yes, they were very effective in suppressing the rebellion in a lot of regions of Spain.
And was that because they were viewed to be more legitimate by some of the local people?
It was just the revolutionary fervor that the breakdown of authority in the regions. It gave the revolutionaries power, and the divide between the class divide in Spain sort of made that bigger.
Right. Okay, so when we're looking at the fighting, were there any sort of particular key battles that really decided the outcome of the war?
Well, there was the ongoing siege of Madrid that lasted basically the entire war. But then there were various nationalist offenses that went after the region of Asturias, the Basque region, the Catalans, and then finally Madrid and southeastern Spain. Basically the military initiative stayed with the nationalists throughout most of the war. For any number of reasons. I would say the most would be that their manpower advantage and logistical advantages gave them the initiative basically throughout, with a few reversals. If Thomas wants to jump in with any other key battles, please do.
All right. Well, we mentioned earlier is it Guadalajara?
Yeah, Guadalajara, I don't know that it was a critical battle because it was a planned nationalist offensive. But it ended up being a Republican victory, especially due to the international brigades. But there was a huge number of Italian troops used in this battle, basically an entire army of just Italians that were technically volunteers, but hey, buddy, you just volunteered to go fight in Spain, kind of volunteer.
Okay.
It's most interesting to me and to other viewers of the battle as kind of a proto-blitzkrieg. The Italians used a number of tanks and some minor air support to try to break through the lines, just as we would see later with German offenses during World War II. They were initially successful. They used these, what they called tankettes, which were very light treaded tanks with just machine guns for armament for most of them. But they bogged down in the offensive. They didn't push their advantage as much as they could. Now, the interesting thing isn't necessarily for the Spanish Civil War, it's for World War II, in that there were a number of international observers at that battle and who watched the battle keenly, and they took away completely different interpretations of what happened. The French, for instance, looked at the battle and said, these tank things, you don't want to concentrate them. Look, they just break down, they get bogged down. If you stop at all, you're going to end up just like those poor Italians did, and you're going to lose. The Germans looked at it and said, well, if they were to press their advantage, and if those tanks were a little more capable, you really have something here, especially if you add in some air support to do some interdiction to keep the enemy reinforcements away. So you have one battle and different observers having wildly different interpretations that influence their militaries in World War II, which I just find fascinating.
Right, and so we were able to read the reports that the French and German observers sent back home these days?
Yeah, I believe those were fairly readily available. I haven't read them myself.
Yeah, sure.
But the observers certainly went back to their home militaries and said, here's what we learned. But what they said after that was completely different.
Right, okay. Another battle that's reasonably famous is Guernica. So that's in the Basque region, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. It's a traditional Basque town. There's the Basque oak there, which is a cultural touchstone. It's a symbol of Basque autonomy and Basque freedom.
The Basque oak, so a tree?
Yes, a tree. A big, massively old tree. And yeah, it was just one of their symbols, as all nations have. And it was the subject of an air attack. Now, this wasn't necessarily the first aerial assault on a city in the world. There were air attacks in World War I, and there were a few on Madrid as well before this. But this is the first one that got true international attention. Quite possibly mostly because of the painting by Pablo Picasso by the same name. But
now, when did that come out? When did that painting come out? Because I'm aware of the one you're talking about, the huge big one.
I believe it was in 1937, right after the.
Right. So it was reasonably quick.
Yes, it was. It was certainly before 1939.
Okay.
And the bombing was in April of 1937, and it was done by the German Condor Legion, which was a German air force that was, again, technically volunteers, and also the Aviazione Legionaria, which is the Italian Air Force, which was, again, technically volunteers, but were certainly given home support. But they bombed this town. It was a market town. It was a logistical center. A number of roads went through the region, which is another reason why it was important. And there were a couple of arms plants making rifles and other small arms in Guernica. But it was bombed, and it had no anti-aircraft defenses whatsoever. It had no planes, it had no anti-aircraft artillery, it had nothing. And the casualties, some estimates are as low as 150, other ones are as high as 7,000. The normal population was 7,000 in the town. It certainly didn't kill everyone. But, I mean, you're talking about a relatively small thing, because this is, again, April of 1937. In just a few years, you're having huge 100 and 1,000 bomber raids in World War II. But it has certainly struck a chord throughout the world at the time. The Nationalists blamed it on the Republicans. They said there was no Air Force overhead. The Republicans torched the city and used dynamite, which they did at Irun, if I recall. But it was absolutely a lie. It was certainly the Nationalists that did this, and there was international outrage, both over the painting and also just newspaper descriptions by witnesses and journalists that came in the aftermath and took pictures and wrote accounts.
So they felt that this was sort of breaking the laws of war or proper conduct in warfare?
Absolutely, especially in American, French, and British newspapers, and there were others as well. The Vatican condemned the bombing as well. But this was seen as something new, that we had crossed a line with the bombing of Guernica, as this is something that is novel on the scene, and the industrial power that was available to air forces now and the destructive power was just incredible. Now, again, the casualties are tiny, maybe as low as 150 people. When the firebombing of Tokyo kills 100,000, Dresden you have around somewhere under 30,000 killed, and you're talking thousands and tens of thousands in a matter of years, under a decade. But this was new. This was novel on the scene, and there was a lot of international outrage over it, and that's one of the reasons why the Nationalists tried to say, oh no, we never did that, when they certainly had.
Okay. And another battle, Oviedo, I think it's pronounced. Thomas, did you want to jump in about that one?
Yeah, the Battle of Oviedo, Siege of Oviedo rather, it was a lot of the, shows the initiative that both sides took, really. Because initially, the city's local anarchists and unionists declared for the Republic, of course, as they did in other regions, and the local commander said that he was loyal to the Republic. The anarchists then quickly organized a column of about 7,000 anarchists and started marching off to Madrid to help the siege. But then the local commander, he decided that he was going to declare for the rebellion instead, now that his opponents were gone. And now that the local miners and anarchists were gone, he just seized the whole town, and the anarchist column turned around and besieged the city and viciously tried to retake it over the course of the next few months until a relief column for the Nationalists arrived.
Okay, and was this sort of... Actually, we might as well go into it now. So when you talk about viciously trying to fight it, now, a lot of civil wars are, by their nature, very nasty conflicts. And we might start with the nationalist side of things. So they had come from Africa with a brutalized, I guess, with the lesson that they had learned was to come down hard and fast. Did they treat their own Spanish people any differently?
Oh no, the whole point was to treat them as Moors, as Jews, as Bolsheviks. They had, especially before the war and during, there was a lot of dehumanization going on in ideological ways, trying to say that these were subhuman, that they were scum, that they were no better than animals, etc. These opponents on the left, and they came in with it was not anything secret within the military. It was, you are going to kill these people, and this was a campaign. I don't know if I agree with Paul Preston's definition of it being a Holocaust, but it was certainly an attempt to what they said was cleanse. Limpieza was the word, to clean Spain of these people that were their opponents. And if you had been an elected leader, you were often put to death. And if you were a unionist or a union leader or somebody that just happened to be paid to put up the union posters, you were killed. And you were denounced, and you were killed at the side of the road, you were killed in cemeteries, you were killed in prisons. It was absolutely atrocious. I mean, an atrocity is an understatement to talk about the various things that happened in Spanish towns when a nationalist column arrived. It was absolutely brutal, and it was designed to be brutal.
So did they have specialist units that carried out these sort of, did they have death squads or something, or was this something that every army unit did?
Well, the army units tried to move on. Now, I'm not saying that they didn't try to also kill people, but their goal was to take over and they quickly usually handed off the executions to phalangists or Carlists that were just rabid in their support of the rebellion. And they also used any number of unhinged people that had been imprisoned by Republicans over the years, freed them and used them as murderers and hit squads. There were also industrialists and landowners that they had money, they had stockpiled arms before the war, and the people that were loyal to them, they gave them the rifles. They said, you know who opposed us, and they went out and killed them. And it was certainly on purpose. This is not collateral damage. There's no way to defend this whatsoever. Right. You have to say that this is atrocities. This is war crimes. This is among the most terrible things you can do. There was rampant rape by these people as well. And yeah, it was the army. I definitely don't want to do any kind of clean Spanish army myth, because that would certainly be a myth. But there were phalangist columns and industrialists that got their own workers, and there were Carlists and any number of other people that just did absolutely atrocious things to their opponents that were completely unnecessary.
Right, and Thomas, so with the Republican side of things, what would it look like, when the Republicans recaptured a town or city? Was there similar sort of revenge tactics in place?
There were some revenge killings in place, but not quite the scale of the Nationalists, mostly because the Republicans didn't recapture places for very long before a Nationalist counteroffensive came in.
If we want to look at numbers, you're looking at some estimates that put it at 70,000 that the Republicans killed. I think I'd go more with the estimates of the 35 to 37,000, and you have much more than that on the Nationalist side, in the 130,000 range being a minimum. 100,000 is certainly a minimum for how many the Nationalists killed. You're talking almost an order of magnitude larger.
Yeah, wow. So let's talk about anti-clerical violence then. What did that look like? So if the Republicans aren't capturing new areas, this is in areas that they held from the start. Is that correct?
Yes. It was mostly in the breakdown of authority at the outbreak of the war, when just everyone unleashed their anti-clerical outbursts. They burnt down churches, killed local nuns, local priests, just everything religious, really.
Right.
Approximately 6,800 were killed. Religious people were killed.
Right.
Through the war.
And this was within the first few months of the war?
The majority within the first few months.
Yeah, there's the 85% were within the first 6 months. However, the majority, and by a far margin, was after the first month, which is a little telling. It wasn't necessarily local people that ended up killing the religious. It was sometimes an outside group coming to the town, and they saw the priest. Maybe the locals got along with him, maybe they didn't, but they hadn't killed him up until that point. So the new column that was going towards the front would kill the priest and burn down the church along the way. So it wasn't necessarily one of the myths of the Spanish Civil War with the anti-clerical violence was that it was all just a reaction immediately. There was certainly an ideological underpinning to that as well. There were people saying things like, men will never be free until the last king is strangled in the entrails of the last priest. And people carried that out.
Right.
Which is, that's just as brutal as what the Nationalists were doing. This is a terrible, terrible thing to say, and it's a terrible, terrible thing to carry out. And
so
it wasn't...
We're looking at areas like the Basque region, for example. So it was anti-clerical violence concentrated in any areas in particular?
Not in the Basque region. The Basque region, I believe it was in the range of 70 priests, 60-something if I recall, that were killed in anti-clerical violence, and then another 14 by the Nationalists who came in and killed some Basque priests, which is a demolishing of another myth of the Spanish Civil War, is that the Nationalists were on a religious crusade to save Spain, which is absolute garbage as well.
Okay. Well, let's look at say Catalonia. What was the fate of the church in Catalonia? Were there sort of Catalonian identified priests?
There were a couple of Catalonian identified priests, but because of their strong anarchist presence in Catalonia, it was probably the heartland of anti-clerical violence.
Right.
Certainly.
Yeah, okay. And so this is... okay, all right. Well, actually, you mentioned before that the Vatican condemned the Guernica bombings. Did they say much about the conflict in general?
You have to... Well, okay, yes, they said a number of things, but there was only 3 direct mentions of the Spanish Civil War during the time. The pontiff at the time, Pius XI, was a fairly mercurial man, a man of passions, I guess you could say. They also said he had a temper. But they tried to do a peace proposal at one point. They tried to send it during the Nationalist offensive against the Basques, and they routed it through Madrid, the telegram, which is an absolutely inexplicable choice, because the Republicans saw that, hey, there's something from the Vatican that wants the Basques to drop out of the war, and we're not going to send that along. It wouldn't make any sense for them to send it along. So it's an absolutely baffling move by the Vatican, especially given the skill of the diplomats at the time. But they did make, like I mentioned before, the 3 papal encyclicals of March of 1937, and all 3 have a bearing on the war. Mitbrenner Sorge is the papal encyclical that outlines the Vatican's problems with the various fascist movements, and it certainly applied to Spain, and the encyclical was given a less than widespread publication in nationalist Spain. And the church was very reticent about fascism at that point, seeing that there were serious problems in what they called the idolatry of the state. And then there was Divini Redemptoris, which was the church's stance that you basically can't be a Catholic and a communist at the same time, that there was basic disagreements, and I've written on that on Ask Historians a number of times. Okay. And then there was Gnosis Muy Conocida, which was about anti-clerical violence, which they were hearing from not only in Spain, but also Russia and Mexico and a few other locations. And the Vatican at the time had a hard time discerning what is propaganda, what is truth, and what is really going on the ground in Spain. Because there was a lot of exaggeration from the nationalist side, and I would also say from the Republican side, as to what was going on as far as casualties, as far as atrocities, as far as descriptions of events. And it was very difficult for the Vatican, to figure out exactly what was going on. They certainly knew that things were troubled in Spain, that there was... a culture in the Spanish Catholic Church that was very different from what they were trying to get across. For instance, they called for a crusade in Divini Redemptoris, but it was supposed to be a crusade of contemplative orders praying, not men picking up guns and killing everyone.
Right, okay. So you run into the same issues of translating a term like jihad, for example.
Yes.
It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
Exactly.
Right, okay. Okay, so with the international support, did Russia... So Russia coming in for the Republicans, I guess, how did the war end? If Madrid never fell, is my understanding, how did they surrender? What did that look like?
Towards the end of the war, there was a sect within the Republic that really didn't feel that they could fight any longer and wanted to surrender on reasonable terms with Franco, which he would never accept, it turned out. So... but then on the other side, there was Negrin and his Communist Party that wanted to hold out until the expected European war started, which it did, but a few months later, after the war ended. So a general called Casado, he was pivotal in the initial defense of Madrid and was still commanding in Madrid. He organized a small coup against the Negrin government, which then it broke out in early 1939 against Negrin, and there was intense street fighting in Madrid, between the communists who were trying to defend the government and the members of the coup who wanted to just end the war completely. And that just led to a complete breakdown in defences of Madrid. So the Nationalists just pretty much walked in.
Right. And with the siege of Madrid, was food an issue? How hard was life for people within the city?
There was rampant hyperinflation during the war, with the Republic's monetary policies. Famine was becoming quite a problem towards the end, or mass hunger, really, as food regions were taken by the Nationalists, especially the grain of the south, and also the collectivization in Spain was a bit of a mixed basket, which led to some regions just reverting back to self-sustainability and not actually exporting anything.
Right, okay. Okay, so there was an attempt to keep the war going because they were expecting, fighting to break out in Poland. Was that?
Yeah.
Right, okay. Boy, it'd be interesting to wonder what would have happened if it had. But I guess that doesn't really get us anywhere, doesn't it? Yeah. I should slap myself on the wrist for even mentioning a what-if scenario on an Ask Historians thing, shouldn't I? Alrighty, so once the sort of official surrender happened, how quickly was it in effect? Did the Republicans or the Republican-aligned movements lay down arms across the board, or was there holdouts? What did that look like?
There were holdouts right through until the early 60s, with guerrillas in the hills fighting against the Francoist authorities.
Wow. So like these guys would just be up in the mountains and just shooting at people as they walked past and stuff?
Yeah, it was quite a minor movement, since approximately 450,000 Republicans fled across the border into France at the end of the war.
Right. Because I guess no matter how they surrendered, the trusting that the Nationalists would stick to the terms of the surrender. I mean,
the surrender was it was just unconditional surrender, really.
Right.
Well, yeah, and you had earlier examples like the Basques who surrendered to the Italians because they were trying to avoid getting killed, and the Nationalists marched in and said, well, that surrender doesn't count anymore, and they started the executions the next day. So, you're talking about a track record of breaking agreements immediately.
Yeah, right. So, it seems remarkable that they would surrender, knowing that, because I can't imagine that the Nationalists would show mercy at all to anyone who held up arms. Was that the case? Did they go and kill, everybody, or?
Well, they didn't kill everybody, but they threw a number of people in prison. They would take advantage of you economically, etc., make sure that you couldn't work. There was all sorts of people that did survive as Republicans, but it certainly wasn't easy.
Right. And so do you guys know much about the aftermath of the Civil War? So, obviously, you could argue that the scars haven't healed even today. But for how long was Spain, because I can't imagine, killing this many people wouldn't leave a severe impact on the country for a long time.
I believe that there was martial law right up until 1948 or something like that. Just a long time. I'm less well read on the afterwards in the Spanish Civil War, but yeah, you're certainly talking about a massive population decrease and big economic problems that also preceded the war. Spain wasn't a roaring economy at any point except for possibly during World War One. Before the war, perhaps right. Thomas has more information on the aftermath than I do.
Alrighty then, we might actually wrap it up. So this has been really good, guys, and I'd just like to thank you for coming on the podcast. I'll have to have you on, Jason, again to talk about Pius the 12th. I understand during the Second World War, which is a topic which comes up reasonably often. But yeah, so thank you very much, guys. Any last words before we knock it off?
No, I really enjoyed this. I thought it was extremely fun and love to do it again.
Cool, excellent.
Yeah.
Alrighty then. Well, thanks again, and we'll see you around on Ask Historians.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, dear listener, for joining us today. Coming up next fortnight, we will have the first of a two-part episode, which could really almost be a three-part episode, but we've scaled it down for you. I will be interviewing Snickering Shadow on the topic of the Mesmerican group known as the Tarascans.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.